Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk with you about Chesterton's post, which is something that comes from his book Orthodoxy, in a part I haven't actually read yet, in the series where I'm producing sort of an audiobook of it, on this channel. It's from chapter 7, The Eternal Revolution. We have remarked that one reason offered for being a progressive is that things naturally tend to grow better. But the only real reason for being a progressive is that things naturally tend to grow worse. The corruption in things is not only the best argument for being progressive, it is also the only argument against being conservative. The conservative theory would really be quite sweeping and unanswerable if it were not for this one fact. But all conservatism is based upon the idea that if you leave things alone, you leave them as they are. But you do not. If you leave a thing alone, you leave it to a torrent of change. If you leave a white post alone, it will soon be a black post. If you particularly want it to be white, you must be always painting it again. That is, you must be always having revolution. Briefly, if you want the old white post, you must have a new white post. But this which is true even of inanimate things is in a quite special and terrible sense true of all human things. An almost unnatural vigilance is really required of the citizen because of the horrible rapidity with which human institutions grow old. It is the custom in passing romance and journalism to talk of men suffering under old tyrannies. But, as a fact, men have almost always suffered under new tyrannies, under tyrannies that had been public liberties hardly 20 years before. Thus England went mad with joy over the patriotic monarchy of Elizabeth, and then, almost immediately afterwards, went mad with rage in the trap of the tyranny of Charles I. So again, in France, the monarchy became intolerable, not just after it had been tolerated, but just after it had been adored. The son of Louis the Well-Beloved was Louis the Guillotined. So in the same way in England, in the 19th century, the radical manufacturer was entirely trusted as a mere tribune of the people, until suddenly we heard the cry of the socialist that he was a tyrant, eating the people like bread. So again, we have almost up to the last instant trusted the newspapers as organs of public opinion. Just recently, some of us have seen, not slowly but with a start, that they are obviously nothing of the kind. They are, by the nature of the case, the hobbies of a few rich men. We have not any need to rebel against antiquity. We have to rebel against novelty. It is the new rulers, the capitalist or the editor, who really hold up to the modern world. There is no fear that a modern king will attempt to override the Constitution. It is more likely that he will ignore the Constitution and work behind its back. He will take no advantage of his kingly power. It is more likely that he will take advantage of his kingly powerlessness, of the fact that he is free from criticism and publicity. For the king is the most private person of our time. It will not be necessary for anyone to fight against the proposal of a censorship of the press. We do not need a censorship of the press. We have a censorship by the press. Now, the thing about this, and once again from Orthodoxy, the thing about this is that it applies to all human institutions, every single one of them, from governments to businesses to chess clubs. Anything human is either growing or dying. And in fact, all human things are dying. That part's guaranteed. The only real question is, do they grow, and do they grow fast enough that they grow faster than they die? This is true even in a very literal biological sense. Even in children, you have apoptosis, cells killing themselves off all the time. It's the natural progression of our skin. It's just the way things are. In this world, in our changeable world of time, things are all dying. It's just some of them are growing more quickly than they're dying. And so when you look at institutions that aren't actually dying off in practice, it's because they are growing faster than they're dying. But or more properly, they're changing faster than they're dying. And there are two ways they can be changing. And this distinction that I'm going to use comes from John Henry Cardinal Newman, I believe. I didn't actually get it from him. I heard it quoted from him. So unfortunately, take that with a grain of salt, because I may be misattributing. But there are two types of change that you can distinguish. There is development and there is mere change. And development is change which is according to the nature of something. So for example, it is in the nature of a puppy to become a dog. When the puppy becomes a dog, it is developing into a dog because it is following its nature. It becomes not more puppy-like, but is an incipient dog and becomes more of a dog as it develops into a full dog. If the puppy were to change into a kitten, that would not be development but mere change. It would become something else, something that's not in any sense contained or foreshadowed or pointed to by a dog. I mean, obviously, there's similarities between them. I don't mean that there are no similarities, but rather that it would become less dog-like and more cat-like in that change. And so this is a very useful way of looking at all changes in, well, in a lot of things, but in organizations in particular, human organizations. And so you can look at all the changes that are happening and ask, is this a development or is this a change? And it's, I don't want to go in an apologetical direction, because my channel's not about apologetics. I did apologetics when I was a kid, and it's a very valid discipline, but at the same time, it's in the modern world, in the modern context, and to some degree, especially just for me personally, it's not a very productive one. Apologetics is the sort of thing that can't be done quickly, that can't be done simply. It needs to be done, I think, over a very long period of time. And I mean years or decades. And consequently needs to be done very much on a personal basis. And that's not something that's possible here. So I'm not interested in apologetics as such. I'm interested in discussing ideas. And this idea has, though you can take this in an apologetical direction, that the church lasting 2,000 years and developing without changing is something remarkable, utterly remarkable in the history of mankind. I mean, to take a distinction from that, something where you have a human organization that is still around but has changed rather than developed, in the sense we were talking about developing. Look at the United States government. It would not be very recognizable to the people who had originally devised the Constitution. The way you have a tremendous amount of centralization. The way that the United States shifted from being a plural to being a singular. That you don't say, you say the United States, not these United States, for example. Somebody said that, I think, a year ago. I remember it being remarked on. Someone actually said, these United States, like the Spanish Los Estados Unidos. And it was really remarked on. It's kind of strange. It's the way people talked before the Civil War, not after. And then you look at it, was it the 18th Amendment, I think? I'm probably misremembering the number, and I apologize. The one that incorporated, that required of the states what was required of the federal government, which itself was very odd. Originally, a lot of the idea was that there were things the federal government couldn't do specifically so that the states could do them. And so passing that prohibition, passing those sorts of prohibitions on, for example, are very strange. When I say strange, I don't mean that they weren't a good idea necessarily. I'm not talking whether they're a good idea or a bad idea, but they were very foreign to the original idea. This was not at all the direction things had originally started in. Now, of course, and the Constitution itself provided for a facility to change. I think, very wisely and precisely because it was recognized that things that don't change, because they will change anyway, if you don't have any, if you don't have any provision for changing them for the better, they will only change for the worse, and consequently fail. But the United States in its current form, things like the direct election of senators, people who don't own land voting, all sorts of things of that nature, would be very foreign. Now, in contrast to, for example, the abolition of slavery was actually, minus the way it was imposed upon the states, a very natural progression. You see that, the dissonance between slavery and the Declaration of Independence, where it states clearly we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And that's equal before the law, obviously. That it's largely in context repudiation of things like titles and nobility and so on, but it is also really inherently a repudiation of the concept of slavery, and especially being born into slavery. It's not entirely a repudiation of the concept that you could sell yourself into slavery, but certainly it's a repudiation of the concept of being born into slavery. It also just, since people love to misunderstand things, I'm not saying it's fine to sell yourself into slavery. I'm just discussing whether or not this was consonant with a particular idea 300 years ago. Anyway, So the point being, that is an organization that is still around. We still have a government, but it has changed very, very substantially. It does very, very different things for, and serves, in part because it does serve a very, very different people. Contrast that with the Christian church, which has developed, but which is still extremely recognizable. And as I said, I don't want to go in the apologetical direction, but there is, I think, something very interesting to look at for other human institutions. When you look at why is it that the Christian church, I'm talking specifically the Catholic and the Orthodox, just leave Protestantism out of account for the moment. But if you look at them, why is it that they have developed, but they haven't changed and become something unrecognizable? And it's because if you look at it over the years, and over the last 2,000 years, there has been a constant process of renewal, a constant stream of people. If you read the lives of saints, an enormous number of them are calling people to task for changing and not developing. They are constantly reminding people, here is what we are supposed to be. Here is the ideal that we profess. Here is what we're actually doing. We need to get back to this. And it's only by that continual process of people pointing out that we've gone far astray and need to get back that the church has managed to... Okay, there's also been the intervention of the Holy Spirit, but leaving that aside for the moment because it manifests in this. And the Holy Spirit will not be around to guide, your chess club. But nonetheless, what is done will not have the supernatural help, but can still, borrow ideas and imitate. The point being, there's a constant stream of people who are looking back to the original ideal and willing to call out present people, from their perspective, modern people, on where they are diverging from this. There also needs to be everybody believing in that original ideal, which is, again, something that the Christian church has, that if you believe that, if the original ideal is something that you believe was handed to you by God, rightly or wrongly, but nonetheless, if you believe it, it's going to carry a lot of weight in the way that a bunch of people deciding how to run chess club may well not. But that aside, it is nonetheless the case that you need to be willing to do that. Now, there's a great example of this from the Middle Ages. And I believe it was, the anecdote, I saw this in Chesterton's biography. I'm pointing at my bookshelf where it is. Chesterton's biography of St. Thomas Aquinas. And he mentioned that there's an interesting story of St. Dominic, the founder of the Dominican order, who was talking with the Pope. And the Pope gestured, so we're talking the High Middle Ages here. And the Pope gestured at the papal palace and said, no longer can Peter say, gold and silver have I none. I'm sorry. Let me give you the context, because many people may not know the history. In the Acts of the Apostles, okay, well, first off, the Pope is the successor of St. Peter, and so is referred to commonly as Peter, that he is fulfilling Peter's role presently. So he's sometimes even called, Peter and so on. But anyhow, so then in the Acts of the Apostles, there's a scene where Peter, with Andrew, again, my memory's failing me, for which I apologize. I don't get a lot of sleep lately, owing to personal circumstances, largely related to small children. But anyway, so Peter is walking with another one of the apostles, and they come up to the temple and going to preach. And there's a blind man or a lame man. Oh, wow. I really apologize. There, who's begging. And Peter said, I'm sorry, lame. He's a lame man. Lame man there begging. And Peter says to him, gold and silver have I none, but what I have I will give to you. Rise and walk. And the lame man gets up and walks off and praises God and so on. So it's a very famous line. So the Pope, now fast forwarding back, getting back to the story, the Pope in the High Middle Ages, when the church became, it was hundreds of years after it was persecuted, and the church became very rich. Although there's an asterisk, because in theory and often in practice, the riches of the church are held essentially in trust for all mankind. So, for example, like right now in the Vatican, there's it's estimated in billions of dollars worth of art, but the Vatican can't go and sell that. You can't take the Pietà and sell that. You can't take the Sistine Chapel and sell that. that is something that is always kept there so that people can come and look at it and behold the beauty of it. So in one sense, they, own billions of dollars of art, but in another sense, it's completely illiquid in that the only thing they can morally do with it is hold it so that people can come visit it and see it and study it and take photographs of it and so on. But that being said, that's the ideal and often the practice, but was by no means always the practice. And sometimes popes have lived as well as kings, and so, and especially in the High Middle Ages, you saw a lot of this sort of thing. And so the Pope gestured at the papal palace and said, "No longer can Peter say, 'Gold and silver have I none.'" To which Dominic immediately replied, "Yes, and neither can he say, 'Rise and walk.'" So that is the very heart of renewal. That is the very heart of pointing out this has degenerated. This has gotten away from what it is supposed to be. And so taking this out of that context where it just happens to be, the church happens to be the most successful human organization in all of history, by far. And I don't mean that in a material sense. I mean that in a longevity sense and a keeping it being the same thing it was sense, but merely developing rather than changing sense. So when you look at any human institution, whether it's a bunch of people, I hesitate to call this an organization, but whether it's a bunch of people all tweeting on the same hashtag, and that, they changes, there are new ones coming around all the time, and they develop a sense of community, and they develop a sense of what they are, and they very often change, and people complain, this isn't what it used to be, and so on. Whether it's something like a chess club, whether it's a business, whether it's a collection of a professional collection, whether carpenters or authors or whatever, any of these things are human institutions, and therefore they will degenerate over time. And so the only way to keep them being what they are is to be constantly on guard against this, and to be constantly looking for how it is changing, noticing how it's changing, pointing out how it is changing, and calling on everybody to come back to what it should be. So it's true of everything, big and small, run by people. The alternative is these things will, when I say die out, they will die out, but very often this is something that needs to be borne in mind. A lot of things that die out don't always obviously die out. Very often they are taken over by something else. You see this very often in business. The number of large companies that actually survive any meaningful number of decades is quite small. The asterisk being that usually they don't die in the sense of say, okay, we're done, shut the doors, sell off all the assets, close down the name, everyone just, leaves today, and then, have a fire sale on the assets afterwards, because there's still a lot of value even in a failing company. And so what almost invariably happens is that at essentially, a very discounted price, some other large company will buy up the failing company and then take them over, make changes. And very often a lot of people lose their jobs over this. A lot of plants get shut down. A lot of machinery gets disposed of. But because it has been bought, because the name may even stick around a bunch, this isn't, nearly so clear. You see that in a lot of other things. Other institutions where they're kept around. A lot of organizations that start off dedicated to, whether it's woodworking or archery or hunting or knitting or whatever it is, they will very often degenerate into social clubs for some of the early people who had been part of it. There's no intention that, so that's something where, again, it has really radically changed. We're just a bunch of people who know each other, get together and eat and drink together once a month or what have you, is not the original thing by any means. And so it's something that you, if you want to avoid that, you always have to be careful of. It's also something, incidentally, that those sort of things also become sort of self-fulfilling. Because once you become a social club for the people already in the club, it gets very, very hard to bring in new members, because why would you want to go become a part of something for people who know each other when you don't know them? There becomes very little reason to join such a thing. Which results, one of the key signs when you see this is you'll get a lot of first time people, because the thing still has its name. Let's say it's an archery club. And by the way, this has nothing to do with the archery club I go to, which is thriving and taking new members and all about archery. The But I'm just using that as an example, so I don't sort of accidentally pick on anyone. The so in the that is to say, because the archery club I do go to is so vibrant, no one could possibly think I'm talking about it, and so I'm not accidentally gonna talk about anyone. Anyhow, so the point being, suppose you have an archery club, you'll still call it the, our locality archery club, and so every now and then someone who moves into town or whatever is interested in archery will show up, and then they'll quickly discover, well, you don't actually shoot your bows. Some of you didn't even bring them. Most of you just have your bows sitting there, and you're just talking about stuff I don't know and people I've never met. And, they smile and they're polite, and then they don't show up again. In its really advanced stages of decay, everyone there is fine with that. So, at that stage, it's going to be shut down in a few years. And everyone sort of, knows where it's going. So there are no mysteries there. And this isn't, doesn't really apply because you don't really have an archery club anymore there. But, in the beginning, when you have people who are, when you see that people like to spend a lot of time talking before they actually take out their bows and shoot. That's the point at which, if you really want this to survive as an archery club, when you see that starting to happen, that's when you want to take steps in order to encourage making sure that people actually take their bows out and shoot, so that you get back to that archery so that it stays an archery club. And, again, I'm giving specific, very specific example just to make the thing concrete and intelligible, but this generalizes quite a lot. But, in the case of archery, you might do something like, say, how about we institute, and I'm sorry, now, the naive thing would be, let's institute a policy where you must shoot for the first half hour. Well, then people just show up late. But to revitalize things, that's where you propose things like, let's have, let's play a certain sort of game in the beginning. Let's have, let's have a league or something like that, an archery league or something like that, where, everybody shoots, and you just be careful to make sure that you're not excluding people who haven't, signed up in the beginning for the league. So you don't take up all the slots or something, like all of, don't take up all the targets with people shooting. Make sure that other people can work in. But that's where you do things like that will appeal to people who are still interested in archery, who haven't, given up on this. And it will bring the thing back to being about archery. Now, of course, the league itself will degenerate into something else. It'll probably become exclusive. And that's where you need to come up with other things, other ideas, whether it's, happy hours, open events, let's switch to something else that doesn't have, whatever the problem that is becoming exacerbated in the league, you then talk about things like, well, we'll do a different sort of target shoot, an open invitation where you can come and shoot at, 3D targets. It was a great idea someone in my archery club had years ago. Very, very popular event. They do in certain parts of the winter, and they shoot at targets and so on. Shoot at the 3D foam targets, and it brings a lot of people in who wouldn't normally come, and so it helps to refocus things on archery and so on. And then again, that itself will degenerate. So you always need to be looking for, in what way is this degenerating? What is the problem sort of, inherent in it, and how do you what is the problem inherent in it, and how do you, counteract that? And if you possibly can, think about, what will the problem in that be, and how should we make it easy to counteract it once that starts getting a problem itself? So it's a lesson about human institutions. As I said, I used an archery club because it's simple. An example I'm familiar with in the archery club I'm going to is quite vibrant. But it applies all over the place. It applies to message boards. It applies to forums. It applies to all sorts of things like that. They all degenerate, so just if you want the thing to survive and continue to be itself, be prepared to always be renewing it back into what it had been. And be prepared to do that not by lecturing people on how they're not doing things right, pointing it out won't necessarily hurt, but lecturing rarely accomplishes anything. But be prepared to think of ways of accomplishing that sort of renewal. And there we actually come to the concept of development. One of the things that developed in the Catholic Church, and again, you can look at this even just in secular grounds. One of the things that developed was the religious institutions, the monasteries and the nunneries, that people who really needed to be different were given an outlet to be different, so they didn't wreck things for average people, and average people didn't wreck things for the unusual people. And so you had that sort of development where they could often become inspiring and could work together in a whole variety of ways. But that's the sort of thing which is a development where the tensions inherent in people, the tensions inherent between people were given an outlet where people could go and do the things that they really want to be doing, channeled so that it is all Christian in that way. So that people who want to marry and raise children can marry and raise children in Christian marriages. People who want to, don't want children can go and not have children and still do this in a Christian way. And so it's, again, an excellent example of where the thing develops in order to, as there are pressures to degenerate, it develops to give these things outlets and counteract what's going wrong in order to keep it what it is actually supposed to be. So, so wrapping that up, it's something, because we're all part of organizations, so it's something to look out for. And if there's an organization you love, then you're going to want to try to take care of it. And this is a key part of how you take care of it. You need to be continually looking for how you can renew it. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.